episode 182 Above Ground Podcast, Grace with Judi Merriam.
Disclaimer. The hosts of this podcast, Will Foley and TPP, are not medical professionals, and this is not medical advice. Both Will and TPP have firsthand experience with mental illness. They have their own perspective and own thoughts on mental health challenges. Above Ground Podcast was birthed to help those who struggle with their mental health through honest dialogue. By speaking openly and sharing tools, they foster connection. By fostering connection, they convey hope. With connection and hope, we can continue to increase awareness. These conversations aim to break down the walls while building stronger foundations for positive mental health. This is Above Ground Podcast.
Coming at you live with real conversations about mental health from the peer perspective, it's time for Above Ground Podcast. Now your hosts, TPP and Will Foley.
Hey, what is up, everyone? Welcome to episode 182 of Above Ground Podcast. Grace with Judi Merriam coming up momentarily. Just wanted to say happy holidays to everyone. We are into December, and it is that holiday rush time, and it is very important to keep tabs on your mental health every day of the year, but especially going into the holidays, as the holidays can be very stressful just from having to be everywhere or feel like you have to be everywhere, feel like you have to do everything, feel like you have to buy everything. Don't forget to take care of yourself. You can't get from an empty cup. So make sure you take care of your mental health as well as your physical, spiritual, and emotional health. A really good way to fill up your cup is to give back, because no child should go without Christmas. And there are no shortages of toy drops, but I wanted to tell you about the Sage's Circle toy drop that is going on until December 10th. That's right, the Sage's Circle at Point Plaza at 443 Saratoga Road in Glenville. Such a cool place with crystals, different meditation supplies, positive things. It is such an amazing energy in that room and in that building. They are doing a toy drive to benefit Toys for Tots up until December 10th. You can go into the store and drop a new unwrapped toy, and you're going to feel really good about it. And don't forget, Sunday, December 18th at Empire Live is the next Upstate Punk Rock Flea Market. That's right. Come on out, do some Christmas shopping with some really cool stuff, man. See Above Ground Podcast. And wish us a Merry Christmas. And maybe Krampus will be there too. So now, episode 182 of Above Ground Podcast, Grace with Judi Merriam. Hey, what is up, everyone? Welcome to Above Ground Podcast.
Above Ground Podcast, because you can't serve below.
No, you cannot. Mr. TPP, what's up, my friend? How are you, man?
I'm doing.
Doing?
How are you?
Well, so by the time this comes out, we're a couple weeks removed from Thanksgiving. But since it is actually Thanksgiving weekend, how was your weekend, man? It was your birthday too recently, so you've had a little bit of stuff going on. So how was everything?
A lot of stuff going on. It's this time of year is kind of dreaded. It brings anxiety, but it is what it is. I think I've gained a little bit more resilience through some of this, just because I don't know, being a little bit more aware and being more open to sitting with uncomfortable feelings and emotions and everything that flows with it. I just kind of embrace it, I guess. It is what it is, right?
Right. It is, man. It is. You got to embrace it. It's time to ride the wave. You know what I mean? Learn how to surf.
Learn how to surf.
Learn how to surf. Get the body moving a little bit. You know.
Who can help us learn how to surf? Is today's guest.
Awesome. Yeah, let's get into that right now.
Judi, welcome to Above Ground Podcast. Judi is a singer, author, mom, wife, speaker, many other things. But today she is here to talk about her son, Jensen. And this is a topic that we do address on occasion. We are just grateful that Judi is open and willing to talk about these things, because the more we do talk about them, the more light is shed on them, can possibly help somebody out along the way. And we've always thought that. So we try to have these open discussions with willing participants like Judi. So thank you for being here, Judi.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Will, for having me. I am honored to be here.
Yes, thank you, Judi, very much for taking time out of your out of your busy weekend to be here with us. Can you give us an overview of where your book, Empty Shoes by the Door, stems from and how you've tell us about your loss, please?
Sure, Will. Well, I have my middle child, Jensen, who took his life December 23rd of 2011. So we're going on 11 years now. And as I worked through my grief and talked to people, several people just kept saying, why don't you write a book? Why don't you write a book? And I started writing things down that I was learning along the way or questioning or whatever that seemed important. And I just kept a list of 3x5 cards for years and years and years. And about 5 years ago, I actually started writing because I could not find a book after Jensen died. I'm a huge reader, and I went on the internet and I just looked for books and books and books. And so many books were either written by dads or written by men or written by mothers who said, oh, my son took his life, but Jesus is good and now everything's wonderful. I thought, yeah, I don't feel that way, so your book is not helpful to me. So I wanted to write something completely truthful and honest about the entire journey. And then the pandemic hit, and that was a gift to me to just have the time to write and write and write and write. And so that's what I did. And that was the whole idea behind my book, to share my story truthfully, honestly, and what I did, and to help other people who want to help someone grieve, know what to say, what to do, what not to say, all those things that those of us who've lost someone hate to hear. And now my book came out last May of 2022.
Congratulations on that, on the release of that. That's amazing. That's awesome. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing this with us. Can we start in your grief process now? After you've been through all of this and you've had the book come out, what has your grief process turned into, and what does it look like now compared to what it may have been the last several years while you were excavating all of these things to write about?
Excuse me, Will. I think my grief process was a really active one. I thought if I don't grieve in a healthy, active way, then it's going to be a second death. And it can't be, because too many people need me. I have a husband, I have 2 other children. And so I really went into the darkness. I sat with the darkness. I dove in knowing that unless I did, there was no way to work through the grief. So then my first draft of my book was absolutely everything. I wrote down absolutely everything I could think of. And that was for me. And I worked with Marion Roach Smith, who is a memoir coach. And I worked with her, sent her my first draft. She made pages and pages of notes, which is exactly what I wanted her to do. But I felt like after my first draft, Will, that I had actually said everything that I needed to say. And there was a tremendous amount of healing in that, because I told every detail. But then that was for me. It wasn't acceptable for everyone else. So I then had to come up with a second draft for everyone else. So I left a lot of things out. I worked really hard to not so much focus on death, but help people work through grief. And when my book finally came out, it was like a huge burden was lifted, because I had shared it. I had done the work. I'll never be totally healed. We're never totally healed after any kind of death like that. But because I did the work, the functional healing, my ability to live from day to day has been transformed. And I am so greatly appreciative of that.
I love how you describe that you've done the work. And Tim and I have talked about this, and I'm sure that you're familiar with Byron Katie, of course. I talk about her list of emotions that she keeps on her website, The Work. And I actually include it in show notes all the time, because I think it's one of the most useful tools that I've ever had, because Tim and I always talk about language and how we describe things and how we attach our feelings to things. And writing things down is one of those important ways to really discover things and to let go of things. Were you a writer? Obviously, you're a singer, so you obviously have writing in somewhere in there, whether it's songwriting or whether it's poems or lyrics or whatever. So obviously you write in some degree. Was the writing a discovery for you as a way to let things go? Because it seems like it took you a little bit to get to that point of whether you wanted to write or not.
Well, I'm not a songwriter, but I am a huge wordsmith, and I love words and I love lyrics, and often it's melodies and lyrics that catch my attention. And if I can't understand words in a song, then forget it. I just don't even want to listen to it. But I started a journal after Jensen died, and I put a picture of Jensen in the front of it, and I wrote, Jensen, my love, my loss, my healing. And I just wrote things down. I wrote quotes. I wrote particular scripture verses. I wrote scripture verses that I thought people really misinterpreted and threw at people who were grieving that should be interpreted a different way. I wrote down song lyrics. I wrote how I was feeling. I wrote everything down. So when I went back to eventually write the book, I used my journal a lot. But I've kind of always written on and off, mostly just short essay things like that. I've never taken much writing or many writing courses or anything, but I started taking some free memoir classes probably about 4 years after Jensen died. So at least a good year before I really started putting things down on paper to into cohesive thoughts.
I find it interesting that some of your words about like the writing and journaling, that's how I started, I guess, my book. And I never had an idea of writing a book. It was all just journaling because it helped me. I exactly like your process. Like I would just write stuff down, and if I call it connecting the dots. So if I found something, over here that was bothering me, I would try and connect the dots to figure out where it's coming from. So I would write down little things and be like, maybe this is this, and maybe that, little pieces here and there, and like you said, it was part of healing. It was part of the work, as you say. So it's cool to hear you say that stuff and just see how it worked out for you.
And I think, Tim, I've told other parents who've lost children, I've suggested maybe they journal. Part of too with the journaling is I didn't want to forget things. I didn't want to forget how much it hurt. I didn't want to forget when I was so dark that I thought that I couldn't climb out of that hole. I wanted to remember those so that could be useful to other people. We use the term, oh, you're better now, and better is not a word to use. I wanted to remember what it felt like so that when I reached out to other moms, especially who lost a child to suicide, I could remember how it felt. And if I didn't write it down, I might not have remembered. So journaling was huge for that too.
Exactly. I agree. We've talked about this stuff numerous times, and I was like, we should come up with some kind of suicide etiquette, sort of, so to speak, with like your help with these words and how to address things and how other people, it's hard, obviously, to not offend somebody along the way, but we try to do our best and incorporate certain words that may be a little bit lighter on people.
And that's why I did at the end of my book, the something to think about section, so that to give other people some instruction on what to say, what not to ask, how to encourage all those things.
You had just mentioned about you wanted to remember the darkness and the hole that you were in. How were you able to kind of navigate maybe a balance and not get stuck in that hole yourself?
That's a good question, Tim. I think part of it is personality. I'm not a dark personality. I'm realistic. Occasionally my husband accuses me of being cynical, and I say it's not being cynical, it's being realistic. So my grief journey was a bit easier compared to people who might deal with depression or darkness, which is not part of my story. But I also, people have asked me, how did I know what to do? And I just have to attribute it to grace. I love the word grace, and that God's grace somehow showed me what I needed to do, because there wasn't a lot of instruction out there. And I just knew that I didn't want to feel that way forever. But like you said, I wanted to remember how he felt.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely. It's just it's a different perspective that we just got, because here you are talking about probably one of the worst things that any of a parent can go through, talking about how you're, the depression side of it. And I don't know, I'm just speaking for myself. I feel like I would fall into that dark side of it. I'm more of a dark person anyways, but I feel like it would be an easy slide into that dark space and not be able to get out.
And I think it is. And I have some friends who are there. One of the books I read by a mother whose daughter took her life in the same manner my Jensen did, this mother, when I read her memoir, I thought, oh my gosh, this woman, I don't know if she's going to make it. And 2 years later, she took her life too. And that's the thing about grief. It's such a singular journey. It's such an individual journey. And we want to lump everybody together and say, you need to do this and then it'll be okay. But we can't do that because it's so individual. And I also think I told myself I was going to speak the truth right from the beginning. That if I was really miserable, I was going to tell people I was miserable. Because I know people that try to pretend that they feel better than they do. And that's not healthy. And I think speaking the truth and telling someone, or even myself, how I really felt, allowed me to then move forward into something different. When we pretend it's something it's not, we can't heal.
Yeah, I think you said it. I mean, before with kind of what we say here is you know you have to feel it to heal it, and you wanted to sit in it and almost get comfortable. And I'm a firm believer that is the way to do it. And so it's cool to speak with you and hear that you did it and you're doing it. So that's great.
It's not easy.
No.
And boy, that darkness can be all consuming and you can think you're never going to get out. But as a gentleman, I wrote about him in my book, Jerry Sitzer, he lost his wife, mother, and daughter in one car accident. And he said, we can't get to the light if we do not move through the darkness. If we do not head towards the sun, the rising of the sun, then we can't get to the light. So we have to go through the darkness. If we constantly want to run away from the darkness, we're never going to see that sunlight again.
I refer to that spot a lot. It's interesting how you chose to describe sitting in the darkness and how we describe it, because Tim and I have had numerous conversations about that room at the end of the hall in my house that I have that's very inviting, that has great lights and great music. And then when I get in, the door shuts, the lights flip off, and the switch moves and you can't find it. That's kind of what I like in my depression too. And I find that your description of how people journey through grief is very poignant, because it is an individual journey. Do you think that you said you will never heal? And I obviously you can never heal fully from something like this. Has your grief process has changed? I wanted to know if anger ever played a part in your grief process. And I'm sure it probably has, but some people have a harder time with anger and things. So I just wondered how anger has played into your grief process.
Anger had a huge role in my grief process. Well, I was angry at first, not so much because, shock carries us for quite a while. And shock is such a gift. And I'm grateful for that because it allows us to function at first when we don't know how to function. But the shock eventually wears off. And mine wore off around the fifth month, maybe after Jensen died. And I was angry at Jensen. I was angry at other people for the stupid things they say. I was angry, really angry at God. I told God I hated him. And I was angry at just about everything. But I also realized that was part of it. I needed to be angry because if I didn't acknowledge my anger, again, I wasn't going to move forward. I wasn't going to deal with it. It was just going to fester. So that was part of the honesty of just yelling at God and yelling at Jensen and yelling at people, not to their face, but behind their backs. People don't appreciate it when you yell at their face. So yeah, anger was a huge part of it, but it also didn't last all that long once I admitted it and allowed it to take its course and run its course. Then I was able to move forward in the anger and finally figure out a way to deal with the anger too.
Well, speaking of things that people say that they shouldn't and things, we're all about tips, tools, and stuff here. So I was wondering if maybe we could start with a couple of things not to say to someone. And then maybe you can come back on the other side of it and come up with another couple of things that you can say or what you should do or what you think some etiquette is better for.
Well, I think part of that is an individual thing too, Will. Some people don't mind things other people do, but some of the things that people say like, oh, he's in a better place. And especially in the church, we love to share verses like Romans 8:28. And we know that all things work together for good, and meaning that God's God did this for a reason. That's one of the ones I can't stand too, that there's a reason for this, if there's a plan for it. We're not God. We don't know that. To say that to somebody makes God sound like a monster, and he's not. Or I have a friend whose son just took his life in March, and somebody from her church said, "Are you afraid he's in hell?" And things like that, that people just, why would you even think that was acceptable to say to somebody? Or it's those platitudes. I had somebody say to me, "Well, only the good die young." And nobody purposes to be mean or say stupid things. Nobody thinks, "Oh, I'm going to go hurt Judi now and say blah, blah, blah." But they don't think, and they don't realize the carnage, especially of a suicide death. That's the really hard part. So in my book, I encourage people, first of all, don't use words like still. "Oh, are you still missing your son?" Yeah, I'm going to miss my son till I die. Tim said the holidays are hard. It's been 11 years and I still don't like the holidays, because it's a reminder that there's an empty place at the table. It's always there. So I encourage people not to use still. Don't share Bible verses. People know their own Bible verses they want to go to. Don't think that you have to make it spiritual and share something out of the Bible. If somebody asks you, okay, but there were times when that one Bible verse, Romans 8:28, was shared with me so many times, I thought, the next person that says this, I'm going to punch them right in the face, which sounds a lot like Jesus, right? So I just, in the platitudes, forget the platitudes. Don't use the platitudes. Just simply say, "I am so sorry your child died. I am so sorry that your mom died. My heart aches for you." Those kinds of things show that you care, but you don't take it to the next level, where I really think people say those platitudes, those uncomfortable things, because they're trying to make sense in their own head. But we can't make sense out of something senseless, so it's better to just say, "I'm so sorry," or "I don't even know what to say. So please forgive me for not saying anything other than I'm sorry."
Yeah, that's well said. Well said. Very well said. You had mentioned, I'm only on chapter 3. I'm so early in the book, but you had just said something just now that made me think of your struggle with in the beginning with motive, and the whole whys, whats, and that kind of thing. It just, I don't know. It just, something you just said sparked it in me. Do you still question? Do you ask yourself that question still to this day?
I actually don't anymore, Tim. Occasionally, I'll just say, "Oh, Jensen, why'd you do this?" But that constant searching, that constant playback in my head of, "Jensen, what were you thinking? Why did you do this?" It sort of ended, I think, while I was writing my book too. I don't think we're never going to know, really, unless somebody comes up and says, "This is why Jensen took his life," even though he left a note. It didn't explain anything. It just said it was his time to go, and it was nobody's fault. But because I'm not asking that anymore, when I talk to new moms, especially who've just lost a child to suicide, and they're so obsessing over why, I don't tell them to stop it, because I know they need to. I know they might need to do that for many, many years, especially for people who don't leave a note. But that has helped me to realize eventually, when I thought, "Oh my gosh, I'm not constantly asking why anymore. I'm not looking for things. I'm not obsessing over this." It helps me to encourage moms that there may well come a day when you don't continue to ask why, but it's really okay that you are, because you need to do that right now.
Yeah, like you said, I think it all goes back to that, individualized, singular journey type. Let people kind of grieve the way they grieve.
Yeah, we all think that we should have seen something, or we should have done something to stop it, or we should have known, or we should have asked a question. And again, in hindsight, we can maybe pinpoint something, but nothing in particular for some of us. So but we assume it's our fault. We assume we missed something. So that's, I think, why we obsess even more, because we want to let ourselves have some peace about the fact that we really maybe didn't miss anything at all.
Can you share with us some of Jensen's, favorite things that he loved to do?
Jensen was an animator, an illustrator. He loved doing cartoons. He was so funny. He was hysterical. That was his gift, causing everyone to laugh. So he loved drawing, excellent artist. He loved writing, filmmaking. He wanted to go into film and animation. That was his goal. And he used to have all his friends be in his movies, and they'd be at our house running around like idiots and eating my food and making noise. Or he'd be at my husband's office, and then my husband would say, "Don't trash the office," and things like that. So he was so creative that way. And he had hoped to work for Pixar someday, and that was one of his goals. So the creative side of Jensen, definitely not a sports person, not an outdoors person, but artistic side was definitely his strength.
Do you have anything of his that has been released? Was he fortunate enough to release stuff before he passed?
He won a couple of spots on commercials. Like, he did commercials for a couple of commercial contests. Contests, so we have those. He entered a couple of his films, his animated films, in contests, and he won for those. So we have those. Nothing that was out public everywhere, but every now and then something just pops up how things pop up occasionally on the web, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's Jensen's. I think maybe one of his friends might have shared it or something like that.
It sounds like it would be an interesting narrative to weave your story through his art. That's why I asked.
Now there's an idea for another book. Thank you, Will.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's just like, because with him being a visual artist, was he depressed? Did he have a mental health diagnosis? What was Jensen's background?
And he didn't, Will. And that's the hardest thing, that there wasn't any mental health diagnosis. We didn't see depression. Now, back in hindsight, would we have? I still don't think we would have, but my husband and I have talked that, people don't take their life unless there's something wrong. So there must have been something there. He was one who didn't want to grow up. He always said he didn't want to be an adult. He liked, he still had his favorite stuffed animal at age 18. He was very sensitive and very kind and thoughtful and loving. But to pinpoint, did we take him in for a diagnosis because we saw something? We didn't. And even his doctor, after Jensen took his life, his doctor came to our Jensen's memorial service. And the month after Jensen died, when I was in the doctor's office for my daughter's annual physical, Jensen's doctor called me in his office and said, "I have gone through everything I have written about Jensen, everything, and I never saw anything. There was never any cause for me to be concerned." And, Jensen's one of those 10% that they say in suicide awareness that showed no signs of anything. So even if we went back, we probably would have talked about suicide more. I didn't really talk about it with my kids because it didn't ever cross my mind that any of them were going to take their life. But no, he was not in the mental health system. That's always a conundrum, to know what to do, especially for teens like Jensen who showed nothing.
That's really hard. If you're okay with sharing this, do you have any of that in your family at all that you know of?
I don't. On my side of the family, we have some issues, but not any depression. I think on my husband's side of the family, we look back now and we say, yeah, we think there are some depression issues that were never diagnosed. And
which isn't unheard of by any stretch of the imagination.
No. And it's really hard to pinpoint those, because we see those more in some of the older people when depression was never talked about, and when nobody dialogued with somebody about why are you so down? Why are you saying things like this? But there's a possibility that we see it on my husband's side of the family.
That's why we do what we do, and I'm sure that's why you do what you do, and you speak to people and try and open up these conversations, because they're not the typical conversation to have, and people are maybe awkward with them or uncomfortable with them, but like it or not, they're conversations that need to be talked about.
Well, and you're right, Tim. And if I had to do it over again, because some of my other friends talk to their kids about suicide, I would have sat my kids down when they were younger and had a dialogue about it. One of the things I've learned that talking about it doesn't encourage it, that we need to have these dialogues. We're afraid to talk about it because we think that we're going to put the idea in our children's head. Well, I'm sorry. If the idea is there, it's already there. Talking about it doesn't put it in someone's head. But if I had dialogued about it with my children, I might have given them tools, or even just say, if you're feeling this way, come talk to me. We'll go get help. Or this isn't the right choice. Let's figure this out. But it never occurred to me to do that. It never occurred to my husband to do that.
Sure, and I didn't make that comment to
No,
make
I
you.
know, Tim.
Okay.
I'm just saying that now,
Yes,
and then I'm not blaming myself, but I do
yeah,
think dialoguing at a young age, it should be part of curriculums. It should be.
that's what I was just going to say, and that's why I feel that way, because we've talked with many people about this, and a lot there's actually surprisingly a lot there was never any signs. We always hear of what to look for and there was none of that. There was close family units, and you just don't know. So I think that's why, yeah, to put it in the school systems, and just not force it down people's throat, but just understand that this is something that needs to be talked about, and death in general. It's something that we're all going to experience.
Yeah.
I think just talking about death itself and grief and the things that follow are things that we can talk about.
In New York State curriculum, we have to do bike safety. So why don't we talk about suicide awareness?
Yes, I agree. I made a mention of it in my book.
It has gotten slightly better. You do have
Yes.
way better, more in tune staff now than you used to have, for sure. But you hit upon an interesting thing about the idea that it doesn't put it in someone's head. And actually, what I've come to learn over the years of doing the suicide prevention stuff that I've done with AFSP and stuff is that actually by asking it may actually cause a shock to the system for somebody to actually bring them back out of something too, because most people do not ask that question. Most people do not think to ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And I think there is some reasons for that. I do think a lot of people, A, don't know what to do, and B, don't want to get involved. Do you think that could be part of it also?
It might be, Will. And I think too, if we ask that question, then we have to make the choice to do something. And it's hard to do something when we don't know what to do, because let's face it, mental illness and suicide are not black and white issues. It's not like you have cancer and you can go get chemo or radiation. So talking about it makes people really uncomfortable. Death makes people uncomfortable. The fact that a young person or even an older person, suicide rates are pretty high among middle-aged men and too. And
yeah, the highest is middle-aged men, actually.
Is it? Okay.
Middle-aged white. Yeah, the highest right now still is middle-aged white men, which is surprising. But I think that has to do with that. There's probably more reported in that than there is, because it's the cultural divide.
I think we also, I know some people that are involved with suicide prevention say that amongst teens and in their 20s that a lot could be suicides that go reported as opiate deaths or something like that, or a car accident or whatever. Because
sure,
again, there's still that stigma.
Absolutely right. It's all about stigma.
But you're right. If we need to ask, we need to get into that place that's really uncomfortable, and we need to dialogue about it. And I think there's still some people out there think, well, if I never talk about it, then it won't happen. And
Well,
let's
as we've
face it, it's
learned,
a lot
ignorance.
easier to not talk about it.
Well,
Look where that's
ignorance is
gotten
not
us.
bliss. Yeah, ignorance is not bliss at all.
I know it's bliss for the person that's not talking about it, but not for anybody else. And the reality is, it's not really bliss for the person not talking about it, because eventually they're going to have to face something.
Right. Eventually, you're going to have to face it at one point or another, regardless
Yeah.
of whether you're ready to or not. It's just that's the inevitable part of this. And that's the individual journey that we're all on. And that's what we have to understand.
It's the credit card. It's the credit card bill that's always going to come. You know what I mean? It's yeah. We don't want these things to happen, but if they do, or maybe when they do, because there's always going to be stress. There's always going to be hurdles and obstacles in life. So if we don't talk about them, and then someone gets to a hurdle, they don't know how to get over it because we never talked about it. You know what I mean? How do we
Yeah.
expect somebody to do that? It's like,
Yeah.
here, Judy, here's a saxophone. You never played before, but you know what? Here's 3 keys. There you go. Go play it. It's just like that. It's not realistic. You know, we need to, these may not happen, but here, this is what's going to happen if they do. And this can happen, and these are tools to help you over that hurdle.
And I'm a firm believer, especially now, and dialoguing and talking about things to avoid a future problem that maybe will never happen, but what if it does? And you didn't talk about it, and you thought, oh gosh, I remember, I wish I had said something. So you're right. The credit card bill eventually comes.
Yeah.
And even in my book, I say that, there are Jensens in the world who don't show any signs, but we still need to talk about it, and not think that everything's fine just because somebody's not showing a sign, or give our young people tools to deal with.
Absolutely. Yeah. We talk about, we're all about tools, because I think that's ultimately that's what we have to do. It's all we have is tools. Whether it's a positive distraction, that's a tool. If you get lost in anime and writing, that's a tool. It prolongs that moment for an hour or two. And then you realize, oh, I made it to the next day. These are all tools, but I think a lot of it too is, especially with suicidal ideation, which is something we don't really discuss in general, but on top of that, we don't discuss the active and passive thoughts. Some people think about it in a very passive way, and then they themselves judge their own thoughts, it's going to be anchors. You're walking around going, geez, why did I say that? I'm bad because I had these bad thoughts. And we're not taught that, it's not bad. It's not bad or good. It just is. These are thoughts. And here's what we can do with thoughts. And just because you think something, it doesn't make it concrete. So along that whole critical thinking line of things, let's kind of lean that way.
I spoke with someone the other day who said she thinks that for the rest of her life, even though she doesn't have a plan, and even though she doesn't intend to do it, but that suicide will always be in the back of her mind. And
yes, I can.
her.
I can say that my own experience. It's always there.
And I'm glad she shared that with me, because I want to know those things. I don't want to pretend those things don't exist. And that doesn't mean, like she said, that she's gonna act upon it. But it's not a bad thing. I think that's where we really need to change. It's what you said, Tim. We need to change our way of thinking, that just because suicide is in our mind, we're not a bad person. It's not a bad thing. It's not, we're all broken in some way. We're all dealing with issues in some way. And we need to stop thinking that suicide is just a horrible thing to dialogue with somebody about, or that someone's just a horrible person because it's in their mind. Because the reality is, when I was younger, even though I wasn't depressed, there were times when life was really hard and I thought, I just want to die. And how is that any different than someone who's thinking about suicide in reality?
Agree. I mean, if you have you get on stage with a microphone, and you're getting some static, and all of a sudden the cord's bad and your microphone's not working. So does that mean the microphone is bad or you're bad? No, it's just, what I mean? Things happen. There's just things that happen, and we have to understand that there's things that happen that we have no control over. It's not as you say, black and white. It's not the end of it.
We make so many things in life black and white, so many things. And I think the reality is that there are very few things in life that are totally black and white.
I I would have to agree with that. I find that there's very few things that there's actual truth of as well. There's your truth, there's my truth, and I'm not going to argue if you experienced your truth. Who am I to argue with that? That was yours, and I'll just go. That's an interesting perspective or whatever. But there's no reason to say, well, you're wrong. That's false. No, because you experienced it.
And that's with my book too. I made it very clear at the beginning that it was my story.
Yep.
That if my husband or my daughter or my older son was writing a book, their story would be very different because we each experienced Jensen's suicide differently. We viewed it differently. We grieved differently. And that's what you were talking about, that again, it's an individual thing. So my truth would be different than my husband's truth of Jensen's
Correct.
suicide.
Actually, since you brought that up, if you don't mind me asking, a quick shout out to your husband and your two kids. Hugs to them. I just wanted to acknowledge them.
Thank
But
you, Tim.
I think it was your oldest son was the one that was home, right, at the
He
time,
was, yes.
and didn't. Yeah, how is he doing?
Well, I guard my children's privacy very greatly.
Okay.
No, that's okay. He won't mind. My children have grieved differently than I have, and their grief journey is their grief journey. And I've heard some moms say, "Oh, I get so annoyed with my children because they won't talk about their sibling who died." And I sometimes want to slap those moms because it's almost as if they've forgotten that their children lost a child. And let's face it, there's a lot more support for parents than there are for siblings who lose a sibling. But my oldest is, I think both my kids are doing well. They all found, my husband, my daughter, and my son found Jensen. I did not. So they have a different journey than I do. And I think all things considered, I am so proud of my son and my daughter for the choices they've made to deal with life and to heal and to even question their own mental health, wondering, as we all did, whether Jensen was depressed and we just didn't see anything. So I am proud of the way they have dealt with life, but they deal differently than I do. They deal differently than my husband does. And they grieve differently too. One of the things I was so concerned about and I asked my oldest first, I said, after I wrote the book, do you feel like I love Jensen more than I loved you or your sister? And he said, well, first, Mom, I thought you were putting Jensen on a pedestal, but then I realized as you wrote more, you weren't. And he said, and no, I don't feel like you love Jensen any more than you loved me or Kalina. And that was a concern of mine. So I'm glad that they don't, and I'm glad that neither of them thinks that I was, by the end of the book, putting Jensen on a pedestal, because that was not my goal.
When I got the book, I just have to ask because I left it in the book, but for you, does chapter 21, it never entered my mind, is there anything like, does that stand out for you for any reason?
That's an interesting chapter, Tim. Thank you for asking me about that, because when I worked with my memoir coach, again, because my church background is an evangelical church background, but I also kind of knocked the evangelical church in my book a bit for the way they handled death and grieving. And it never entered my mind. The subtitle underneath it is Satan Evil. And I was concerned that people would wonder about where my mind was when I wrote it. But I realized that, in my memoir coach she said, I read it a second time and she said, let's leave it in. I really like what you said and it makes sense. And it was more the idea that, there is good and bad in the world. And for me personally, I believe there is God, but I also believe there is evil. And it never entered my mind that evil would affect my children the way it does, because I believe in God. And yet it does, because again, the world does not function the way it was ever intended to function. And our children have personal choices too, just like we do. We all have free will. We make choices. And I think one of the things we don't talk about sometimes are the lies that our minds tell us. And that's what I wanted to point out in that chapter too, was that there are lies out there. Our minds tell us lies, and we need to fight those lies. And we need to know how to fight those lies, because go take your life. If your mind's telling you that, that's not the truth. That's not the choice that should be made. So there's more than we can see. And I wish that personally I had talking about suicide, talking about the world, that with my kids more, that to giving them tools to fight those lies in their head, to not always listen to what their heads are telling them. Because what your head's telling you at 18 is what my head was telling me at 18. Very different what my head's telling me at this age. So that is why I wrote that chapter, and why I wanted to point out that I do think Jensen believed the lies. I do think Jensen chose to believe the lie rather than say, Mom and Dad, I don't know what's up, but this is what I'm thinking right now. So that's where I came from with that chapter.
Well, it's thank you for that first, but it's interesting because when I got the book and took it out of the wrapper, there was, I don't know if you saw that, I just did a quick, there was this pink plastic thing, and it was almost like a bookmark, and it was in chapter, it opened to chapter 21. Yeah, so I was just like really weirded out. I was like, should I read this chapter first? And
oh, that's funny, Tim.
yeah.
Well, I asked my memoir coach, I said, am I going to sound like a wacko with this chapter? And she said, no, I don't think so, the way you wrote it. So it was from my perspective again.
Yes, no, there's a chapter in my book that I talk about brain gremlins, and it's very similar to that.
And that's a great term. I like that term, Tim.
Thank you.
And I have not ordered your book yet, but Becky spoke very highly of it, so I need to get that on.
I'll have to send you one. Big shout out to Becky too for
yes,
connecting us.
Becky's great.
Yes, she is. Thank you again for being here. This is as we said before, these conversations are priceless. They could be somebody's hand in a time of need, and these are conversations that just need to be had. So thank you for speaking
Tim
up.
and Will, I am more than willing for you to share my personal information. One of the things that brings me redemption is talking with moms, especially who have just lost a child to suicide. So you are always welcome to share my information. If a mom wants to reach out to me, I'm really willing to sit in the ashes and in their brokenness with them as they grieve, because I've been there and I remember it, and it's a horrible place to be. And sometimes it's really hard to find anyone that knows what it's like.
Wow. So we usually wrap up each episode with 3 questions. So, I had a question set, and I think we kind of answered it. So I'm just going to go with my usual. Do you have a favorite or a least favorite word?
A favorite or a least favorite word? I really don't like the word still very much, but I use it myself. So I must not hate it, but still sounds limiting to me at times, especially when we're talking about grief or even somebody's journey through life. Oh gosh, are you still doing that? Or are you still there? Or we use it, I think, in a negative way. I like still when it's used in a positive way rather than a negative way. I just love words, period. And I'm always looking to learn new words. So, oh, yes, my favorite word. I use it a lot, and it's in my book a lot. I love the word grace.
There we go. That's right. Perfect.
There it is, Will.
There it is. That's why. Look at your phone, Timmy.
I know. That's why I just said
my
that.
mantra is by grace I rise.
There we go. All right. Jeff Buckley talking. What is one thing that you would like people to know about your son that they may not know from reading your book?
I don't remember if I shared this or not in my book. After a while, it all blends together. But he was the one teen we homeschooled, but we had a very active homeschool group. So I directed musicals and I directed the choir. And for 23 years, we had a really strong theater choral program. Whenever a new teen came into the group, Jensen was always the very first one to go up to that teen and welcome them into a rehearsal or a meeting, or even our Friday program, our co-op. More so than any other, he was the one that was right there saying hi. Sometimes he made people uncomfortable because they didn't want to be recognized, but he was the one, no matter what they looked like, how they acted, he was the first one right there at the door when he saw someone new come in.
Very nice. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you, Will.
If there was something that you could do or that you would like to see done for mental health as a whole without any restraint, what would it be?
I would love to have more counselors out there, Tim. I just had a mom text me yesterday and said, who are your grief counselors after Jensen died? And one is no longer taking new patients because she's filled, and the other retired. I would love to see as many mental health counselors out there as there are medical doctors. I would love for people to say our mental health is as important as our physical health. So let's get people that others can go to talk about their mental health. I was having something the other day. When I need to, I still call one of my counselors or go see them. They're willing to let me in, even the one that's retired, because and I'm doing well. I'm healthy, I think, in my mental health. But we need to talk to professionals occasionally. Those of us that don't need to go every week, but there just aren't enough counselors out there. Good counselors.
Yeah, there's not enough good medical doctors anymore either. And there's a shortage of all of it now. Shortage of all of it everywhere.
Even with medical doctors?
Yeah, that's what they're starting to find now. They're starting to find that a lot of people aren't going into the professions.
Why?
I think because we live in a post-COVID world. That's why.
Okay.
I mean, let's be honest. It's people's view of public health is very different than depending on which side of the aisle you stand on. So I'll leave it at that.
I don't want to take away the peer support either. And like you said, Judi, you're welcome. You're always welcome to sit with people and help them out. I think people use the term life coach and these kind of mentors and things. I don't want to write them off, because I think that there's a valuable place for that in this.
Yeah,
I agree with you, and
a lot of them are very trained at what they do, and they take it very seriously. So there's definitely places in there for us to bridge if we could figure out the education part of it, because we do have to remember there is some education involved in this. You can read all the self-help books you want, but you still do need to have some actual real world experience, because dealing with real life crisis in real time is a lot different than sitting with someone following, unfortunately.
Definitely.
So yeah. There's different ways to look at it, but we do need way more professionals, but because there is a shortage. That's why I've been doing this, what I'm doing now. I was able to switch careers because of COVID myself. So I'm working in behavioral health direct care now myself. So
good for you, Will. That's great. And I totally agree with you. I can sit with someone, but I always give them names of professionals for where I can't go or take them, because I am not a professional, and I would never presume to try to be with no education. So, but there are fewer and fewer to recommend to the women that I meet with, and that's where I don't know to send people to.
Yeah, we're all coming up against that now. And no system is foolproof or that great when you really look at it, but there's way better ways to do things than we are now currently, for sure.
Well, I would agree with you. And I think, some that people, now that we're dialoguing about mental health more and things like that too, more people are looking for help. And we need to really get on the stick and have more professionals out there or more training.
Judi Merriam, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been a pleasure. I'm so sorry for your loss, but thank you for turning that loss into a great work of honor to your son and tribute.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Tim. I really so appreciate being here and being able to talk about my journey and my book and grief, if it can bring hope and encouragement to anybody else.
Well said. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Until next week, man, get well.
Be safe.
Stay
above.
Thank you for giving us a listen. New episodes every Wednesday. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can share, rate, review, and even subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Other ways to support the show: follow us on social media, share the content, share our episodes. You can also buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/abovegroundpod. For further concerns, show ideas, or just to say hi, you can email us at abovegroundpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, thank you for listening and supporting mental health. Keep the conversation going and stay above.